When we recall Henry VIII wives, our thoughts turn to the salacious stories. In Bullen and Catherine Howard, both beheaded, Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr, both survivors. But there is one queen whose tale is told in a more eerie, wordless tragedy. A fate not determined by steel, but by something much more unkind, erasure alive. Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, was not killed. She was not even publicly shamed. Rather, she suffered a gradual disintegration of self. 17 bleak years of loneliness, shame, and a subtle fall into historical oblivion. While history refers to her as the lucky one, saved from the executioner's blade, her so-called escape concealed a chilling truth. Survival in Tudor England might equal a living death. Her tale is not one of success or riches, but one of what it is like to vanish while still alive. Her body survived, but her name, status, and soul were smothered until nearly nothing was left. Let's go back to 1539, a year that would determine the political destiny of Europe. Relations between Catholic and Protestant powers were at an all-time high. King Henry VIII, having cut himself off from the Pope and the Catholic Church, was religiously and diplomatically alone. In the hope of securing new alliances, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, suggested an answer based on dynastic politics, a further marriage. Henry needed a fourth wife, and across the Rhine, in the Duchy of Cleves, a small but politically strategic German state, lived a noble woman who could bridge England and Protestant Europe. Her name was Anna von Jülich-Kleveberg, known to us as Anne of Cleves. Anointed in 1515 as the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and was brought up in the conventional German court etiquette. She received education in domesticity, needlework, and elementary literacy. She did not know English and had minimal introduction to Henry's court's highly civilized but frequently ruthless culture. Nevertheless, her family, faith, and availability positioned her as an ideal marriage prospect for a royal union. Cromwell, as ever the political strategist, regarded Anne as the ideal bride. She was of Protestant lineage, had noble blood, and was still unmarried at 24, late in terms of marrying by noble standards. Cromwell began diplomatic negotiations with her father, pointing out the advantages of the marriage for both families. Only too happy to cement an alliance with the English throne, the Duke of Cleves accepted the invitation. To assist Henry in his decision, Cromwell dispatched the renowned court artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, to Cleves to take a likeness of Anne. Holbein, one of whose specialties was painting realistic and flattering pictures, sketched a portrait of a dignified-looking, handsome woman with noble demeanor and penetrating eyes. It was enough to win over the king. Henry, at the age of almost 50 and exhausted by unrest, divorces, beheadings, and private tragedies, saw in Anne's portrait the promise of peace. After years of storms, here, at last, was a queen who could possibly bring peace to his court and settle England's future. Talk sped rapidly forward. Cromwell, convinced he'd negotiated both a foreign triumph and an internal peace, sealed the treaty. The dowry was settled, and the royal wedding preparations started. To Anne, this marriage wasn't marriage, it was promotion. She would be Queen of England, one of the most dominant titles in Europe. Her family's dreams and those of the Protestant world were now hers to shoulder. When winter loomed near and bid farewell to everything familiar. From Germany to England, she traveled with a German retinue, intricate embroidered dresses, and an anxious, hope-filled heart, and no knowledge of the language, let alone the customs. She didn't even know what was in store for her. That arrival in England in December 1539 was anything but smooth. The weather was stormy and was seasick. Weary, confused, and cut off by language, she entered a world entirely different from her own. Then came the moment that would transform her life forever. On January 1st, 1540, at Rochester, and first met Henry VIII. The king, who was determined to see his new bride, entered in disguise, seeking a love, nightly meeting. But what he discovered dismayed him. The lady in front of him did not fit the painting. Whether it was her looks, her formal demeanor, or just the emotional remoteness brought by language and culture, Henry was instantly upset. She was unattractive to him. She was awkward. And most critically, she was unacceptable. Accounts at the time state that Henry was appalled. He grumbled of being tricked. He ranted to his intimates in regret and disgust. The bright potential he had witnessed in Holbein's likeness had vanished overnight. But the political wheels were already turning. The treaties were signed. The preparations were all but done. To withdraw now would have drastic effects. And Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind of this marriage arrangement, stood on the brink of disaster. His cunningly prepared plans were coming undone, and the king's displeasure was threatening to engulf not only Anne, but also Cromwell himself. The meticulously planned political arrangement fell apart before it was ever actually consummated. For Anne of Cleves, that initial meeting with Henry VIII wasn't just painful, it was devastating. She had traveled hundreds of miles, abandoned her native land, and braced herself to take one of the continent's highest thrones. But for honor and reception, she received cold contempt. Although she couldn't decipher the English whispers that surrounded her, the body language of Henry and the icy shift in the air spoke volumes. Her destiny had been silently sealed, no longer by edict, but by revulsion. And the worst injury of all, the marriage was never consummated. Henry was so physically repulsed by, and that he couldn't even bring himself to consummate the most rudimentary expectation of their marriage. This non-performance was not just personal, hurt and frustration. It was political. A failure to consummate a marriage to royalty left the door open to annulment and rendered Anne's already precarious position even more precarious. Privately, the king started looking for means to break the marriage. In public, he played on. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, who had been Henry's closest confidant, was made the fall guy. The individual who had arranged the marriage was now held responsible for its breakdown. With Henry's rage growing, Cromwell's detractors at court closed in for the kill. Life became more and more intolerable for Anne. She was married to a husband who loathed her, imposed upon by courtiers no longer sure how to address her, and emotionally severed from her German retinue, who themselves fought to comprehend the shifting sands of Tudor court politics, and desperately attempted to fit in, learning English, embracing new customs, and conducting herself graciously. But nothing could fill the gulf between her and the king. By the spring of 1540, Henry's mind was made up. The marriage would be annulled. His pretext? A previous betrothal between Anne and Francis of Lorraine, an engagement that had already been probed and rejected in previous negotiations. But now it came in handy. It provided Henry with an out that didn't mean he would have to accept the reality that he simply didn't desire her. While the annulment process went forward quietly and remained on the brink of total social death, the engineer of her ascent, Thomas Cromwell, was taken into custody and accused of treason and heresy. By July, he was dead, punished not just for political repercussions, but also as a warning to anyone who would cross the king. His demise left Anne entirely alone, with no actual supporters and no apparent route forward. Confronted by the horrific precedent of Henry's past wives, and Boleyn and, shortly, Catherine Howard, and knew that standing firm might be fatal. She could resist the annulment and tempt the wrath of the king, or she could yield and pray to live. Sensibly, she took the latter option. In July 1540, and stood before the Canterbury clergy and conceded that her marriage to Henry had never existed. Her acquiescence enabled Henry to depict himself as a victim of circumstance, instead of the instigator of a failed marriage. In exchange, Anne was assured financial provision, land, and a titular honor. She would not be queen, but she would be secure, or so it appeared. On July 9th, 1540, just 6 months since their wedding, the marriage was formally dissolved. It came quickly, a sign of how much Henry wanted and gone from his life. But though the formalities were speedy, the effects would be long and lasting, and was bestowed with the name the king's beloved sister. It had a good ring to it, but it was actually a gracious form of political banishment. She was no longer queen, nor wife, simply a token of a diplomatic faux pas. And with that started the second act of Anne's life, as no longer a royal force, but a living memento, preserved in luxury, but deprived of all authority. For the next 17 years of her life, Anne of Cleves held a title rather than a sovereign one. Alou bien aimé Sir du Roy. Although her financial settlement was good by the standards of the day, an annual pension of £500 and several great estates, including Richmond Palace and Chelsea Manor, it was shrouded with debts. Anne's riches were not a prize. They were a stipulation. She could stay in England in comfort, provided she was politically mute, removed from affairs of state, and in no way questioning the legality of the annulment. She was to accept Henry's authority, both as monarch and head of the Church of England, and never contradict his account. Her gilded life was, in reality, an enclosure constructed from expectation and silence, rather than iron and bars. While legally free, it had been reworked as a tightly controlled icon, one that satisfied the king's story. She could not go home, nor could she fully become English. She was, quite literally, a foreigner forever in a kingdom where she might have otherwise been queen. Publicly, the annulment was framed as a mutual, harmonious agreement. Official statements lauded Anne's gracious collaboration and depicted her as being greatly appreciative for Henry's alleged mercy. Yet in back of these diplomatically phrased statements stood a woman deprived of royal authority, muzzled by decorum and condemned to social obscurity. She had not forfeited her life, but she had lost everything else. At a mere 25 years of age, and was in an odd and novel situation. Not wife, nor widow, not foreign princess, nor truly English noble, not politically influential, nor entirely powerless. She was in a liminal place, there but not quite recognized, seen, but no longer seen to be moving things. And there, she had to redefine what it meant to survive, and settled into the houses allotted to her. First the opulent Richmond Palace, then Chelsea Manor, less grand. The estates were respectable and well-maintained, yet they testified as much to her banishment as to comfort. Formerly fated to reign England as queen, she now ruled tiny private houses, her servants more devoted to the crown than to her in particular. Her new position required adaptation and restraint. Although she still held an honorary title and exercised no real power. In court, she was treated with a courteous formality, honored in title, yet excluded from council. She was no longer one of the players on the great chessboard of Tudor politics, but a memento of a game played long past. Maybe the biggest burden was cultural, and struggled to pick up English, but it was only half the fight. The nuanced codes of court manners, the double entendres, the whispered intimacies, these were unavailable to her. Her German background, once an asset in diplomatic circles, became now a cultural scarlet letter against which she was forever other at a more and more nationalistic English court. Even her own life wasn't really hers. The servants and friends allocated to her were selected by the king's advisors, so that even her closest relationships were subject to royal control. Every dress, every dinner, every bit of luxury came at the king's expense, the king who had repudiated her in public. Her very survival was paid for by the same monarchy that had cast her aside, and that dependency wasn't free. Psychologically, it was devastating, and had thought that being married to a king was the ultimate sign of a woman's value. Now, each luxury she was granted reminded her of the crown she'd briefly worn and then lost. She was provided for but not loved, honored but not respected, alive but not living. With the passing years, Anne's appearance at court grew more and more anachronistic. Her political function had been lost years before, and still she persisted, a ghost of a dynastic failure. Where Henry's other wives had died final deaths, and lived on as a testament to royal clemency, a living testament to surviving by submission. She was paraded out at formal functions, her presence used to highlight Henry's bounty, not her own pride, to all but a handful of courtiers, and was no longer an individual but a story, a warning tale of royal displeasure and the cost of unsuccessful diplomacy. The queen who had once reigned was now a testament to Henry's authority, not to her own merit. The personal cost of this exclusion was immense. Deep beneath the veneer of etiquette, and silently suffered from lost identity. She had been brought up to think that marriage to a king was the greatest glory a noble woman might hope for, and she had been deemed unfit, physically, politically, personally. The public demanded she was happy. But the private truth must have been much more complicated. Her days were full of comfort, yes, but also full of silence. Her survival did not depend on strength or wit, but on her invisibility. She was secure only as long as she was compliant. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Anne's plight was how normalized it got. English culture endorsed Henry's mercy, condoning Anne's demotion from favor as if to be expected, almost as if it were a good thing. Her agency, her voice, and her pain were all erased quietly under the cover of royal benevolence. She was not a woman. She was a symbol. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in July 1540, the same individual who had arranged her marriage, signaled the end of Anne's last political usefulness. His execution was a brutal reminder of Henry's absolute power and of the risks of finding oneself in disfavor with him. Cromwell's head was stuck on London Bridge. For Anne, it was affirmation that accommodation had been her sole means of survival. She went to his funeral, as was obligatory, but his death cut her last true link to courtly authority. From then on, and lived in the twilight, a queen without a crown, a woman without a place, a ghost in velvet. Since the day of her annulling wedding, Anne of Cleves lived a strange and precarious part of her life, one characterized not by royal authority, but by discreet imprisonment. While Henry VIII offered her an astounding financial package $500 a year, plus such properties as Richmond Palace and Chelsea Manor, this money came with unspoken conditions that tied her to England and to the court for good. She was one of the richest women in the kingdom on paper. In reality, her wealth was a gilded cage, and was to live in quiet surroundings, to keep politics out of her life altogether, and never challenge the validity of the annulment. She was forced to accept Henry in public as both her king and the head of the Church Supreme in England, an acceptance that took away from her whatever remaining identity she had for her German heritage. In reality, Anne was an outsider perpetually, no longer really English, no longer German, and without a specified place in any court. Her status, as the king's beloved sister, was little more than formal, covering the truth of a former queen relegated to a quiet, restricted life subject to ever-watchful observation. The formal news of the annulment was presented in glowing terms. Official pronouncements commended Anne for her gracious demeanor and referred to her gratitude at the king's clemency. But the picture they created, a willing and happy woman, was one very much staged. In private, and was an overthrown queen relegated to courteous exile, present only because she said nothing. For Anne, this was an exceptional form of social death. She was just 25 years old, but overnight her future had disappeared. She was no longer a royal consort, nor a widow, nor a foreign dignitary. She was a liminal person, someone standing between roles, known to everyone but really belonging nowhere. The palaces that she was given, though majestic, became symbols of her reduced status. Where she might once have ruled the whole court, she now presided over a small domestic staff, faithful not to her, but to the crown that had discarded her. Although protocol required she be honored, it was obvious that Anne had no real power. Having once been courted so fervently by nobles striving for favor, she now became a second thought, a presence at ceremonies, but never at the forefront. Her lack of complete understanding in the sophisticated forms of English court talk further isolated her. Even after mastering the language, she was an outsider in every aspect. Even they, her servants and attendants, were personally selected by Henry's court so that her every move would always be watched. The money she lived on was abundant, but it upheld the degrading fact. All the comforts she knew were paid for by the same king who had spurned her in public. Her clothes, her food, even her roof. Everything was a reminder that her life was supported not by affection or duty, but by compulsion. Being queen was a constant reminder of her inability to be royal. As the years passed, Anne's position at court became increasingly out of touch with the times. She was the last survivor of a failed diplomatic experiment, a reminder of a failed marriage and a failed strategy. In contrast to Henry's other wives, who died either in a tragic manner or left to pursue new relationships, and stayed behind, stuck in time, mute, and existing through subordination. The execution of Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged her marriage, was the seal on her political uselessness. Without him, Anne had no supporter at court. She attended his funeral in dutiful mourning, but his fall was a grim reminder of how instantly power and favor could disappear, and how quickly she might follow him. With Cromwell out of the way, Henry quickly moved to wipe out all evidence of the Cleves connection. The foreign policy that had once made Anne such a desirable bride was abandoned. Now, she stood not only rejected, but politically out of date. Her presence at court was embarrassing, a reminder of mistakes Henry would prefer to forget. Although still accorded outward deference and was steadily relegated to the periphery. She was summoned to royal events, but never brought into council or real deliberations. Her life became ornamental, such as a relic from another era, seen but not interacted with. Her exclusion was made painfully evident when, in arguments between Henry's numerous wives over who would inherit the throne, a question that had prompted Henry's many marriages and was completely disregarded. Then there was the bitter irony. In July 1540, only weeks after the annulment, Henry wed the young and lively Catherine Howard. The haste of this new marriage made Henry's message unmistakable, and wasn't merely spurned, she was erased. Trapped into witnessing the festivities for the woman who had replaced her, and had to smile and clap as the court lavished attention on Catherine. The contrast between the two women was sharp and intentional. While Catherine was young and flirtatious, and was exotic, distant, and, according to Henry's standards, over the hill. As Catherine became established as queen, Anne's exclusion increased. Her already small household was cut back further, her power non-existent. The estates originally intended to comfort her now seemed isolated strongholds, shutting her away from the beat of court life. But fate had its own irony in store. As rumors swirled about Catherine's past affairs and watched history repeat itself from the sidelines. By late 1541, Catherine was under investigation, and soon enough, her fate was sealed. And had survived humiliation, Catherine would not survive disgrace. The queen who had replaced her would be executed, while Anne, cast aside but obedient, remained standing. When Catherine was taken into custody and found herself once again at the center of court drama, she would be required to appear at the proceedings as a passive observer of a vicious fall from grace. Her survival was now evidence of Henry's supposed clemency. Her existence became propaganda, a living warning to others that silence and obedience were the most secure routes under Henry's dominion. Catherine's February 1542 beheading left and the sole surviving ex-wife of the king. She gained a peculiar kind of notoriety, but also a deeper solitude. She was in no category, not a wife, a widow, a court favorite, or a political operator. Safety had come at the price of self. She lived in a middle ground, not truly alive in mission, not entirely abandoned. As the years went by, observers at court started to marvel at Anne's survival skills. She had survived where others died. But this praise overlooked the high cost she had borne. Her freedom, her dignity, and her very identity had been sacrificed for security. As her predecessors took public lives and slipped quietly into a background of everyday routine and solitude. By the time Henry's health was failing, Anne's fate became even more precarious. The court was abuzz with worry, apprehensive of the king's growing paranoia. For Anne, the threat was very real. Would the next king uphold the vows made to her? Or would her foreign heritage and tenuous status render her vulnerable to the next round of intrigue? Her future, as her past, was not hers to dictate. Following the execution of Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII lost no time in cutting off all his connections with the Cleves affiliation. What had been a marriage of political expediency was now seen as an unfortunate embarrassment. Anne of Cleves, formerly a queen, now spurned, was not only rejected as a wife, but erased from consideration altogether. At court, Anne herself was an embarrassing reminder of a failed diplomatic mission and a royal humiliation the king wished to forget. Although still accorded the ceremonial courtesy of a former queen, and was systematically shut out of significant court activity. She was invited to functions, yes, but as merely a figurehead, a mere ornament. Courtiers stopped her offensively when she entered rooms, not out of respect, but in confusion about how to address a woman neither fully royal nor entirely set aside. Most indicative of all was Anne's complete exclusion from plans for the royal succession, a question which had fueled virtually every choice in Henry's marriage history. Although young enough to have children, and was treated as though she had never worn the crown in the first place. The coup de grace came quickly. In July 1540, only a few weeks after his annulment from, and Henry wed Catherine Howard, and was not merely required to attend the wedding festivities. She had to do so graciously. What was meant to be an honor was in reality a public humiliation. Catherine embodied all that and was not in Henry's eyes. Young, English, lively. The court played up the contrast, flaunting Catherine's youth and beauty, while Anne was relegated further into obscurity. From the sidelines, and observed as yet another woman entered a position she had briefly occupied. And still, court life went on without her. Her household dwindled. Her titles were mere formalities. The lavish settlement she had accepted now seemed more gilded captivity, a cozy jail far from power and direction. But fate's ironies are many. By early 1541, whispers began circulating about Catherine Howard's infidelities, and, silently observing the same dangerous patterns unfold, watched royal affection twist into suspicion and fury. Her own downfall had been bruising, but survivable. Catherine's would be fatal. Catherine was arrested in November 1541 and would be required to attend the proceedings, a poignant counterpoint, living evidence of what happened to someone who submitted and survived. When Catherine was put to death in February 1542 and was the last living ex-wife of the king, a survivor amidst ghosts at court. This status brought her an odd kind of fame, but it further solidified her loneliness. She was a paradox, unmarried but not unmarried, foreign but not foreign, not powerful but not entirely powerless. She lived in a social and political no-man's land, alive, to be sure, but stripped of meaning, purpose, and voice. Witnesses at court started talking about the incredible endurance of Anne. She had endured Henry's rejection and survived, a miracle in itself. But survival had been paid for, the total loss of her autonomy and dignity. She had traded life for influence, invisibility for danger. A quiet, smoldering martyrdom. The subsequent years were spent in subdued routine, and continued to run her properties, went through mandatory ceremonies, and retreated deeper into the shadows. Her days were filled with the mundane chores of life on an estate. She was there, but not really living, what is sometimes referred to as a living ghost. As Henry grew ill and increasingly paranoid, even Anne's reclusive existence seemed precarious. With Henry's death in January of 1547, new doubts arose. Boy King, respect her pensions and standing? Or would the fact that she was part of the tumultuous Tudor heritage render her a burden in this new reign? During Edward's Protestant regency, and found tentative alignment, her Lutheran origins harmonized with the new religious reforms. But her utility had been exhausted generations ago. She remained tolerated, but obsolete. Her invitations grew fewer. Her function, symbolic at best. When Edward VI passed away in 1553 and Queen Mary I ascended to the throne, the pendulum of threat swung again. Devoutly Catholic, Mary could have seen Anne, a creation of Henry's Protestant diplomacy, as a threat. But instead, surprisingly enough, Mary preferred to leave her alone. and was far too politically insignificant to stir up. Nevertheless, this tenuous mercy was paid for, and avoided political views, particularly those of religious matters. Her Protestantism rendered her a discreet outsider in a court now shrouded in Catholic ritual. While not persecuted, she was invisible, barred from having an effect, deprived of voice, unwanted in ritual. As Mary's reign went on and didn't yield an heir, rumors of Elizabeth's rise grew louder, and had seen Elizabeth develop from a child into a confident, astute young woman. She might have been of tremendous help, but no one ever asked. Her silence was her protection. Anne's health, battered by years of emotional stress and social exclusion, started to weaken in her 40s. Modern reports suggest respiratory diseases, perhaps tuberculosis, and psychological weariness that no smiling veneer could hide. And then came another change. In November 1558, Elizabeth I took the throne. For Anne, it was yet another challenge to endurance. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's rise to the throne symbolized more than just a new reign. It echoed the turbulence and betrayals that had defined her parents' legacy. Elizabeth's Protestant beliefs and sharp political instincts distinguished her from both her half-siblings, Edward VI and Mary I. For Anne of Cleves, now a relic of Henry VIII's past, this shift in power brought both respect and further distance. Elizabeth was courteous to, but only in the formal way one is to a former queen and wife of one's father. There was no room at this new court for Anne, who cherished youth, cleverness, and political viability. The attributes no longer hers as a woman now over 40 and years out of power, and appeared at court less and less, a silent presence disappearing behind the pages of Tudor history. With her political position boiled down to nothing, and slipped unobtrusively into Chelsea Manor. There, she passed her days attending to household matters and finding comfort in private devotion. Her household staff was reduced to a mere skeleton, just sufficient to provide her with respectability. Her health declined, and her presence practically ceased to be felt at court life. The cheerful woman once strutted around as a diplomatic trophy now existed only in the shadows, cast aside in a land that had long forgotten her. She was alone in all ways, a stranger in her host country, and never established the close friendships that could have broken the walls of her loneliness. Her servants were polite but aloof. They waited on her, but they did not understand her. Her health kept deteriorating, particularly her worsening respiratory condition, possibly tuberculosis or some other chronic disease. Medicine then provided little assistance, and the psychological toll of virtual isolation probably contributed to her physical deterioration. The gradual erosion of her spirit, rather than any disease, perhaps ultimately killed her. By the summer of 1557, Anne was in a critical state. She lingered in her rooms during her last weeks, a rare sighting and a remote concern. She had once been Queen of England. Now she faced death in silence, much as she had lived, ever since her marriage to Henry VIII had been declared invalid. The court paid scant regard. She no longer had anything to contribute to the story of the Tudor dynasty. On the 16th of July, 1557, Anne of Cleves died at Chelsea Manor. She was 41. The cause of death was recorded as fever, probably as a result of her respiratory disease, but the real cause lay perhaps somewhere deeper. Years of being invisible, unheard, and devalued. A gradual, asphyxiating stripping away of meaning and identity. Her passing secured official condolences, but few sincere displays of mourning. Elizabeth I facilitated a dignified burial, appropriate to Anne's royal status, but subdued in absence of the grandeur usually accorded to members of the royal family, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, a last resting place with kings and queens, but her grave was humble. The epitaph was meager, reflecting the subdued marginalization she had suffered for almost 20 years. While she had earlier been touted as a diplomatic achievement, in death, and was largely remembered as a figure rather than an individual. Obedient and humble to the end, she was extolled as the fortunate wife who had evaded Henry's fury. But this legend, constructed to please the crown, utterly ignored the psychological cost of her survival. Anne's erasure was not a quick, gory death like in Boleyn's or Catherine Howard's. It was something more sinister, a slow-motion execution, conducted not by sword, but by silence. Her existence was a cautionary tale of submission and survival, portrayed as a peaceful solution when it was, in fact, an extended punishment. For centuries, historians repeated this sanitized version of her life. But today, modern scholars are beginning to acknowledge the profound cost of Anne's marginalization. Her experience reveals a deeper cruelty, a form of power that could destroy without shedding a drop of blood. She was kept alive not out of compassion, but as a living symbol of royal control, proof that Henry VIII could not only end lives, but strip them of meaning while preserving their outward form. Anne of Cleves did not die by beheading. She perished by erasure. Her tale is a cold reminder that not everything that dies is bloody, and not everyone who survives is necessarily unscathed. The latter part of her life was characterized by the gradual, quiet draining of all that made her human: agency, connection, purpose. Eventually, Anne was a queen in title only, buried in royal soil, but hardly remembered as anything greater than a political afterthought. She survived Henry VIII, but at a horrific price. After 1540, she was not a survivor's triumph. She was a sentence of invisibility, demonstrating that sometimes the worst cruelty is not done with a knife, but with disregard.